Europe's final break. Can the EU really cut off Russian gas by 2027? In a move that signals one of the most dramatic energy policy shifts in modern European history, the European Union has just greenlit legislation that aims to sever all natural gas imports from Russia within the next 2 years. 24 out of 27 member states voted in favor of the proposal, marking a decisive, if not entirely unanimous, commitment to energy independence. But here's where it gets serious. Any nation that fails to comply with this sweeping ban could face penalties starting at 40 million euros. That's not a warning. That's a financial sledgehammer designed to ensure no one quietly slips through the cracks. On the surface, this looks like a clear strategic message to Moscow. Europe is done with Russian energy. The intent is to choke off a critical revenue stream that has long fueled Russia's economy and, by extension, its geopolitical ambitions. Yet beneath the headlines, a much more complicated reality is unfolding. Because while Europe is rushing to close the door on Russian gas, Russia isn't standing still. It's pivoting, fast, toward the east. China, India, Turkey, and other Asian markets are being courted aggressively, with new pipelines under construction and liquefied natural gas terminals ramping up production in the Arctic. The question isn't just whether Europe can survive without Russian gas, it's whether Russia can survive without Europe. And if both sides believe they can, then we're watching the birth of a completely reconfigured global energy order. So let's dig deep. Can the European Union really pull off a total embargo on Russian natural gas by 2027? Can China step in to absorb the volume that Europe is walking away from? And what happens to the countries caught in between? The ones still heating their homes and powering their factories with gas that flows from Siberia? This is a story about energy, economics, and political willpower. And it's unfolding right now. How Europe got hooked on Russian gas. To understand where we are today, we need to rewind a couple of decades. For years, Europe and Russia enjoyed what many considered a mutually beneficial energy relationship. Russian natural gas was cheap, the supply was reliable, and the infrastructure connecting the two was some of the most sophisticated in the world. As far back as 2006, European governments began signing multi-year contracts with Russian energy giants like Gazprom. Together, they invested billions in cross-border pipeline networks designed to move massive quantities of gas from Siberian fields directly into European cities. It was a system built on trust, economics, and geographic convenience. By 2021, just before the war in Ukraine began, the European Union was importing roughly 334 billion cubic meters of natural gas annually. Nearly half of that, around 45%, came from Russia. In dollar terms, that meant approximately 35 billion flowing into Russian coffers every single year. For countries like Germany, Austria, and Hungary, Russian gas wasn't just an option. It was the backbone of their energy grids. Homes stayed warm in winter. Power plants kept the lights on. Factories ran around the clock. And all of it depended on a steady flow of molecules from the east. Then, in February of 2022, everything changed. The war that broke the pipeline. When Russian forces crossed into Ukraine, the European Union faced a choice: stand by and watch or take a stand, even if it meant economic pain. Europe chose the latter. Almost immediately, discussions began about reducing and eventually eliminating dependence on Russian energy. The idea was simple. If energy exports are funding the war machine, then cutting off that revenue could weaken Russia's ability to sustain the conflict. At the time, the European Union set an ambitious target: complete independence from Russian natural gas by 2027. But back then, it sounded more like an aspirational goal than a firm deadline. After all, replacing nearly half of your gas supply in just 5 years is no small feat. And for a while, the reality on the ground didn't match the rhetoric. Even as European leaders publicly condemned Russia and imposed wave after wave of sanctions, the gas kept flowing. In 2023, countries like Hungary, Slovakia, and Greece continued receiving Russian pipeline gas. France and Spain kept importing liquefied natural gas through their port terminals. Some nations even increased their purchases slightly, citing the need to keep critical infrastructure running and citizens warm. By 2024, the pattern hadn't changed much. Politicians would show up at EU summits, denounce Russia, vote for symbolic measures, and then quietly maintain their supply contracts. Many analysts began to assume that Europe's pledge to break free from Russian gas was more political theater than practical policy. The dependencies were too deep, the alternatives were too expensive, and the political will was too fragmented. But then, in late January of this year, something shifted. The vote that changed everything. On January 26th, representatives from all 27 EU member states gathered in Brussels for a critical vote. The question on the table: should the European Union move forward with a comprehensive, legally binding ban on Russian natural gas imports? When the ballots were counted, the result was striking. 24 countries voted yes, 2 voted no, 1 abstained. Just like that, the European Council officially passed the most aggressive energy legislation in the bloc's history. The regulation is designed to completely dismantle Europe's reliance on Russian energy as a direct response to the ongoing war in Ukraine. And unlike previous proposals, this one comes with teeth. Here's how it works. The bill is divided into 2 main components: liquefied natural gas, commonly known as LNG, and pipeline gas. Starting January 1, 2027, the European Union will no longer permit imports of Russian LNG. By September 30th of that same year, all imports of Russian pipeline gas must cease entirely. There's a narrow exception built in for emergencies, a grace period of up to 4 weeks if a country faces an unforeseen energy crisis. But that's it. After that window closes, the ban is absolute. But the legislation doesn't stop at setting deadlines. It also requires every member state to submit a detailed transition plan by March 1, 2026. These plans must outline exactly how each country intends to diversify its energy sources, secure alternative suppliers, and phase out Russian imports without triggering domestic blackouts or economic collapse. To prevent cheating, the EU has also introduced strict origin verification protocols. Every cubic meter of natural gas entering the bloc will be subject to inspection. If there's any suspicion that Russian gas is being rebranded, blended with other supplies, or rerouted through third-party countries to disguise its origin, authorities can step in and block the shipment. And then there are the penalties. The price of breaking the rules, well, it's nothing short of steep. If you're a company caught violating this ban, the consequences are severe. The minimum fine is 40 million euros. But that's just the starting point. Depending on the scale of the violation, penalties can climb as high as 10% of a company's total annual revenue, or 2 to 3 times the value of the illegal transaction, whichever is greater. Let's put that in perspective. Imagine an energy firm with annual revenues of 20 billion euros. If that company is found secretly importing Russian gas, it could be hit with a fine of up to 2 billion euros. That's enough to wipe out an entire year's profit and potentially force the company into bankruptcy. And it's not just corporations at risk. Individuals involved in violating the ban face fines starting at 2.5 million euros. They can also be permanently banned from working in the energy sector. In some countries, Germany, France, and the Netherlands among them, importing Russian gas in defiance of the law could even result in criminal prosecution. The message is unmistakable. Europe is done playing games, but the question remains, can this actually work? The reality behind the rhetoric is, honestly, a lot more complicated than it seems on paper. On paper, the plan looks bold and decisive. In practice, it's far more complicated. Let's start with the numbers. In 2025, EU member states imported approximately 800 million euros worth of Russian LNG. That represents roughly 13% of the bloc's total natural gas market. And here's the catch. That figure only accounts for official statistics. It doesn't include gas delivered through pipelines, which tells a very different story. Take Hungary, for example. In 2025, Hungary imported a record-breaking 7.8 billion cubic meters of natural gas from Russia via the Turk Stream pipeline. In 2026, daily deliveries stabilized at around 22 million cubic meters, another all-time high. For Hungary, Russian gas isn't a luxury. It's a lifeline. And throughout every internal EU debate on banning Russian imports, Hungary has been the loudest, most consistent voice of opposition. Slovakia faces a similar dilemma. In 2025, Slovakia imported roughly 1.4 billion cubic meters of Russian gas, accounting for about one-third of its total supply. For a country of just 5.5 million people, that's a significant dependency. And it's not just Eastern Europe. France, Spain, Belgium, and the Netherlands are also still importing Russian natural gas, though in smaller quantities. The difference is that these wealthier nations have more options and more political cover. But here's where it gets truly alarming. Before the war in Ukraine, Russian natural gas wasn't just used for heating homes. It powered electricity grids. It fueled industrial production. It served as a critical feedstock for chemical plants and manufacturing facilities across the continent. Today, roughly 30% of European households still rely on natural gas for heating. Nearly 20% of the EU's electricity generation comes from gas-fired power plants. And when winter temperatures drop in countries like Germany, Austria, and the Czech Republic, demand spikes even higher. In those moments, governments face an impossible choice: prioritize residential heating and risk shutting down factories, or keep industries running and leave citizens in the cold. After the Nord Stream pipelines were destroyed, natural gas prices in Europe skyrocketed. The EU scrambled to secure alternative supplies from the United States, Qatar, and other producers. But here's the problem. American LNG is expensive. Middle Eastern gas has to travel thousands of miles by sea, driving up transportation costs. And neither option can match the price or reliability that Russian pipeline gas once offered. So when European leaders say they plan to completely eliminate Russian gas imports by 2027, the real question is, at what cost? Russia's pivot to the east is unfolding rapidly, and honestly, while Europe debates its energy future, Russia isn't waiting around. Starting in 2024, Russian energy exports began shifting dramatically toward Asia. Roughly 85% of Russia's coal now goes to Asian markets. About 63% of its crude oil is sold to buyers in China, India, and other parts of the region. And approximately 30% of its natural gas exports have already been redirected eastward. To lock in long-term customers and reduce transportation costs, Russia and China have been fast-tracking one of the most ambitious infrastructure projects in recent history: the Power of Siberia 2 gas pipeline. Originally, this pipeline was designed to supply Europe as a backup to Nord Stream, but after the war began, its route was completely redesigned. Now it's heading straight toward China. The pipeline will start in western Siberia, pass through Mongolia, and terminate in northern China. Once it's fully operational, it will be capable of transporting 50 billion cubic meters of natural gas per year. Combine that with the existing Power of Siberia 1 pipeline, which already delivers 38.8 billion cubic meters annually, and you're looking at a total capacity of nearly 89 billion cubic meters flowing into China every year. At a price of $250 per thousand cubic meters, that translates to roughly $22 billion in annual revenue for Russia. It's a financial lifeline and a strategic pivot that could redefine global energy markets for decades. But China isn't the only piece of the puzzle. Russia is also investing heavily in Arctic liquefied natural gas projects. The most significant of these is Arctic LNG 2, a massive facility launched in 2019 with Chinese companies holding about a 20% stake. So far, 2 production lines have come online. A third is expected to begin operations in 2026. Once fully operational, the project will have a total annual capacity of 19.8 million tons. China has already secured long-term contracts for roughly 4 million tons of that output. Deliveries will be prioritized through the so-called Ice Silk Road, a shipping route that connects Arctic terminals directly to China's coastal LNG receiving facilities. It's an ambitious plan, and if it works, Russia will have successfully replaced much of its lost European market share with a new, geographically closer customer base in Asia. The expanding web, Turkey and India. But Russia's strategy doesn't end with China. In 2025, Russia renewed 2 major natural gas contracts with Turkey, covering 2 critical pipelines, Blue Stream and Turk Stream. The Blue Stream pipeline, which has been operational since 2003, has an annual capacity of roughly 16 billion cubic meters. The Turk Stream pipeline can carry an additional 6 billion cubic meters per year and has been supplying Turkey and parts of the Balkans since 2020. These pipelines represent more than just revenue. They're strategic footholds on Europe's periphery, ensuring that Russia maintains energy influence even as the EU tries to shut it out. India is another market Russia can't afford to ignore. Currently, natural gas accounts for only about 6% of India's total energy consumption. But the Indian government has set a goal to increase that share to 15% by 2030. That means India will need to import significantly more gas in the coming years, possibly as much as 30 billion cubic meters annually. If Russia can secure a foothold in the Indian market now, it could establish a long-term, stable revenue stream that offsets losses in Europe. And given Russia's ability to offer competitive pricing, that's not an unrealistic scenario. What happens if Europe succeeds? Let's assume for a moment that the European Union actually pulls this off. That by late 2027, every cubic meter of Russian gas has been replaced with supplies from the United States, Qatar, Norway, and other producers. What would that mean? For Europe, it would represent a historic achievement in energy independence. It would demonstrate that political will can overcome economic dependency, even when the costs are steep. And it would send a powerful message to Moscow: you cannot weaponize energy without consequences. But there would also be costs. Energy prices would likely remain elevated for years. Industrial competitiveness could suffer as European manufacturers face higher input costs compared to rivals in Asia. And countries like Hungary and Slovakia might face genuine energy security crises if their transitions aren't managed carefully. For Russia, the loss of the European market would be significant, but not fatal. If the pivot to Asia succeeds, Russia could replace much of that revenue. The margins might be tighter, the logistics more complex, but the market would still exist. And that's the real question. Can China, India, Turkey, and other Asian buyers absorb the volume that Europe is walking away from? The answer is probably yes, but it won't happen overnight. And it won't happen without significant infrastructure investment on both sides. The deeper question here is, this isn't just a story about pipelines and pricing. It's about the future of global energy markets and the geopolitical order that depends on them. For decades, Europe and Russia were locked in a relationship defined by mutual dependence. Europe needed gas, Russia needed revenue. And despite political tensions, that relationship held. Now that era is over. What comes next will reshape trade routes, redefine alliances, and determine which countries hold leverage in the 21st century energy landscape. Europe is betting it can build a future without Russia. Russia is betting it can build a future without Europe. And the rest of the world is watching to see who's right. Because in the end, this isn't just about natural gas. It's about power. And in the global economy, energy is the ultimate currency. So, something remarkable just happened in the world of aviation. And honestly, it has the potential to reshape an industry that's been dominated by 2 Western giants for over half a century. According to recent reports from The Australian, orders for China's domestically produced large passenger aircraft, the C919, have now surpassed 1,200 units. That alone would be newsworthy. But here's the detail that's really turning heads across the global aviation community. GE Capital Aviation Services, an American company, has placed an order for 20 C919 aircraft, valued at $2.2 billion US. Let that sink in for a moment. An American aviation leasing giant, operating in a country that's home to Boeing, one of the two undisputed kings of commercial aircraft manufacturing, has just committed over $2 billion to a Chinese-made airplane that, honestly, most industry insiders dismissed as a long shot just a few years ago. This isn't a symbolic gesture. This is a massive, strategically calculated investment. And it raises questions that go far beyond a single purchase order. Why would a U.S. company choose a plane from China over proven aircraft from Boeing or Airbus? What does this say about the C919's actual performance and market viability? And perhaps most importantly, could this signal the beginning of the end for the Boeing-Airbus duopoly that has controlled the skies for generations? In this deep dive, we're going to unpack the full story behind this landmark deal. We'll explore the technical capabilities of the C919, the economic forces driving GE's decision, and the broader implications for the future of global aviation. Because what's happening here isn't just about one airplane. It's about the rise of a new competitor in one of the most strategically important industries on the planet. Let's get into it. For the past century, two names have defined commercial aviation: Boeing and Airbus. Boeing, the American aerospace titan, has been building aircraft since 1916. Airbus, the European consortium formed in the 1970s, emerged as Boeing's only serious competitor. Together, these two manufacturers have carved up the global market for large passenger jets, leaving virtually no room for anyone else. Their dominance isn't just about market share. It's about infrastructure, relationships, and decades of operational trust. Airlines around the world have built their entire fleets, training programs, and maintenance systems around Boeing and Airbus aircraft. Switching to a new manufacturer isn't like buying a different brand of car. It requires massive capital investment, regulatory approval, pilot retraining, and a leap of faith that the new product will perform as promised. For years, that created an almost insurmountable barrier to entry. Countries like Japan, Russia, and Canada tried to compete in the large passenger aircraft market. Some achieved limited success in regional jets or niche categories. But none could crack the stranglehold that Boeing and Airbus held over the mainline commercial aircraft segment. Then China entered the game. In 2008, the Chinese government launched the C919 program with a clear goal: develop a domestically produced large passenger aircraft capable of competing directly with the Boeing 737 and Airbus A320, the two best-selling narrow-body jets in aviation history. At the time, the announcement was met with widespread skepticism. International aviation experts questioned whether China had the technical expertise, supply chain infrastructure, and regulatory credibility to pull off such an ambitious project. After all, building a safe, efficient, certified commercial airliner is one of the most complex engineering challenges in the world. Even advanced industrialized nations struggle to do it independently. Critics argued that even if China managed to build the plane, it would likely be inferior to Boeing and Airbus products. They predicted it would never receive the international safety certifications needed to operate in global airspace. And they assumed that even if it somehow cleared those hurdles, no serious airline or leasing company would risk their reputation by ordering an untested aircraft from a manufacturer with no track record. For years, it looked like the skeptics might be right. But then, slowly and methodically, China began proving them wrong. The C919 program didn't happen overnight. It took nearly a decade of design, testing, iteration, and certification before the aircraft was ready for its first flight. In May of 2017, the C919 achieved a historic milestone. its maiden test flight. The plane took off from Shanghai Pudong International Airport, stayed airborne for about an hour and 20 minutes, and landed successfully. It wasn't a long flight, it wasn't particularly dramatic, but it was proof of concept. China had built a large passenger aircraft, and it could fly. But flying once in a controlled test environment is very different from earning the trust of the global aviation industry. What the C919 needed next was certification, official recognition from international regulators that the aircraft met stringent safety and performance standards. That process took years. But eventually, the C919 received airworthiness certification under the latest international standards. That was the green light airlines and leasing companies had been waiting for, and once that certification was in hand, the orders started coming in. Countries like Brunei, Thailand, and Germany placed orders. Airlines across Asia began expressing interest, and as of today, China has secured orders from 36 different airlines, with the total number of C919 orders exceeding 1,200 aircraft. But the order that really made the world pay attention came from the United States. GE Capital Aviation Services, commonly known by its acronym GCAS, is one of the largest and most influential aviation leasing companies in the world. For those unfamiliar with how the aviation industry works,